The world was on fire. From the frozen steppes of Russia to the sweltering jungles of the Pacific, humanity was locked in a brutal, sprawling conflict. We think of World War II in terms of massive armies, thundering tanks, and skies black with bombers. We think of it as a contest of industrial might and raw courage. And it was. But it was also something else. It was a poker game, a global high-stakes game where the chips were human lives and the pot was the future of civilization. In this game, the best hand didn't always win. Sometimes the player with the most nerve, the most convincing lie, could steal the whole pot with nothing but a pair of deuces. What if the most powerful weapon in the war wasn't the atomic bomb, but a well-told story? What if an entire army could be created out of thin air, with rubber tanks and radio chatter, and convince the enemy it was real? What if the key to winning a decisive battle was a dead body dressed in a uniform, carrying a briefcase full of lies? These weren't hypotheticals, they were real strategies deployed by desperate people in desperate times. They were audacious, insane bluffs that had no right to work. But they did. They shifted fronts, saved cities, and altered the course of the war. This is the story of that hidden war, the war of deception, illusion, and outright lies. It's the story of how a handful of clever minds played the ultimate bluff and convinced the world's most powerful armies to look the other way. Number 17 was a stage magician, the secret weapon of the Desert War. His name was Jasper Maskelyne. Before the war, he was a famous British stage magician. He came from a long line of illusionists. He could make you believe you saw things that weren't there. When the war broke out, he believed his unique skills could be an asset. He joined the Royal Engineers, convinced he could use magic to fool the enemy. His story, mostly told in his 1949 book, Magic Top Secret, is one of the most fantastic tales to come out of the war. It's a story of grand illusions played out, not in a theater, but in the vast, empty canvas of the North African desert. The problem in North Africa was existential. The Suez Canal was the lifeline of the British Empire, connecting Britain to India, its oil supplies, and its forces in Asia. If the German Afrika Korps, led by the shrewd Erwin Rommel, captured the canal, the consequences would be catastrophic. The major port of Alexandria was under constant threat of air raids. Maskelyne claimed he was tasked with a monumental challenge: make Alexandria disappear. According to his account, he assembled a team of specialists, including carpenters, electricians, and artists, which he called the Magic Gang. Their solution was pure theater. They couldn't actually hide the harbor, so they decided to move it. A few miles down the coast in a desolate bay, they built a complete replica of Alexandria's harbor at night. They constructed fake buildings, a dummy lighthouse, and even imitation anti-aircraft gun emplacements that would flash and bang. When German bombers approached the real Alexandria, the city would go into a total blackout. At the same time, the fake harbor would light up, creating a tempting and obvious target. The bombers, he claimed, fell for it night after night, dropping their payloads on an empty patch of sand and plywood. Maskelyne's most famous claimed achievement was related to the Second Battle of El Alamein in late 1942. This was the turning point in the North African campaign. The British commander, Bernard Montgomery, needed to launch a massive offensive, but he had to fool Rommel about where and when the attack would happen. This deception was codenamed Operation Bertram. Maskelyne and his unit were supposedly central to this plan. The bluff had two parts. First, they needed to hide the massive buildup of tanks and artillery for the northern attack. They disguised tanks as trucks using light canvas and plywood shells, which they called sun shields. From the air, a division of tanks looked like a convoy of ordinary supply lorries. They hid artillery pieces in similar ways and concealed vast supply dumps. The second part of the bluff was to create a fake army in the south. They needed to convince Rommel the main thrust was coming from there. They built hundreds of dummy tanks, some inflatable, some made of wood. They laid a fake railway line that seemed to extend for miles into the desert, suggesting a major logistical buildup. They even created a fake water pipeline. To complete the illusion, they used sonic deception, playing recordings of tank noises and construction sounds to convince German intelligence an army was massing where there was only sand. When the attack finally came on, October 23, 1942, the German command was caught by surprise. They had directed their strongest units south, anticipating the fake attack. As Montgomery's real armored division smashed through the weakened northern lines. The victory at El Alamein was a huge boost to Allied morale and marked the beginning of the end for the Axis forces in Africa. Maskelyne took a large share of the credit for the success of Operation Bertram in his book, However, modern historians have cast serious doubt on his claims. The documents declassified since the 1970s show that Operation Bertram was a very real and very successful deception, but it was planned and executed by the professionals of Dudley Clark's Force, the official deception directorate for the Middle East Command. Maskelyne was a part of it, but his role was likely that of a low-level camouflage officer in charge of building some of the props, not the mastermind he portrayed himself to be. Researchers like Rick Stroud, in his book The Phantom Army of Alamein, have meticulously dismantled Maskelyne's story, suggesting it was a brilliant piece of post-war self-promotion. The man was, after all, an illusionist. His greatest trick may have been convincing the world he was a secret weapon. The truth is likely more mundane, but the story he told captured the imagination. It spoke to the idea that the war wasn't just won by soldiers, but by dreamers and tricksters. Did the British government encourage his exaggerated story after the war as a form of propaganda? And how many other magic tricks from the war, big or small, remain completely undocumented, their secrets taken to the grave by the men who performed them? Number 16, can you win a war with wooden canvas? Imagine being a pilot in 1940 flying a bombing run over southern England. Your mission is to destroy the enemy's air power on the ground. Spot an airfield below. Rows of fighters and bombers are parked neatly, waiting. You dive, release your bombs, and see explosions erupt among the planes. You fly home, mission accomplished. Except it wasn't. The planes you just destroyed were made of wood. The airfield was a fake. You wasted your bombs, your fuel, and your time, while the real planes at the real airfield a few miles away were safe. This was the simple, brilliant, and surprisingly effective bluff of the dummy airfield. This type of deception was not new, but World War II elevated it to an industrial scale. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, the Royal Air Force was stretched to its absolute limit. Every pilot, every mechanic, and especially every aircraft was a precious resource. Losing planes on the ground to German bombers was a devastating blow. The British Air Ministry created a special unit, Colonel John Turner's Airfield Construction Service, which became masters of illusion. They built hundreds of fake airfields known as K sites and Q sites all across the country. K sites were dummy airfields for daytime use, complete with flimsy, life-size replicas of Hurricane and Spitfire fighters. Q sites were for night, using a complex system of lights to mimic the landing strips and taxiways of a real airfield under blackout conditions. They could even simulate the lights of a landing aircraft. The goal was simple misdirection. A German bomber crew flying at night or high altitude had only a few moments to identify a target. A well-lit Q site was an irresistible target. The crews manning these sites were often a small handful of men who would turn on the lights when enemy planes were near, wait for the bombs to fall, and then rush out to put out fires and repair the runway for the next night's performance. It was incredibly dangerous work. According to records from the UK's National Archives, these dummy sites were attacked over 440 times. The strategy worked. It drew bombs away from real, vital airfields like Biggin Hill and Kenley, allowing the RAF to preserve its strength at a critical moment. The German High Command's own intelligence reports from the period frequently mentioned successful attacks on airfields that in reality were nothing but fields and plywood. The Allies weren't the only ones playing this game. The German military also used dummy installations extensively, particularly on the Eastern Front. They built fake airfields, decoy railway yards, and even entire sham industrial plants to confuse Soviet reconnaissance and bombing raids. In the Pacific, the Japanese used similar tactics. On islands they were defending, they would construct fake aircraft out of bamboo and palm leaves to make their air strength seem greater than it was, hoping to deter an American invasion or draw fire away from real defensive positions. The Americans, in turn, built decoy airfields on islands they captured to fool the Japanese into thinking their operational bases were in one place when they were actually somewhere else. It was a constant cat-and-mouse game of illusion. The resources required were minimal, some wood, canvas, and paint star, but the strategic payoff could be immense. It was a low-cost, high-reward bluff. The effectiveness of this depended entirely on fooling enemy intelligence. A key study on this topic found in the declassified A-Force and the RAF in the deception plan for El Alamein highlights how photo reconnaissance was the primary tool. So the decoys had to be convincing from the air. This led to an arms race of sorts. Decoys became more sophisticated with details like fake oil stains on the ground, scattered equipment, and even dummy personnel. In response, photo interpreters became more skilled at spotting the telltale signs of a fake, the lack of tracks leading to the planes, the unnatural uniformity, the way shadows fell on a canvas surface compared to a metal one. It was a battle of wits fought between model makers on the ground and analysts staring at grainy black and white photographs hundreds of miles away. So, what are the lingering questions? How many lives were directly saved because a bomb fell on a wooden plane instead of a real one? We have numbers on attacks, but the direct human cost saved is almost impossible to calculate. Did the enemy high command ever fully realize the scale of the deception, or did they continue to believe their own exaggerated reports of destruction? And in the age of satellite imagery and digital surveillance, could such a simple physical bluff ever work again? Number 15, how do you trick a warship into scuttling itself? In the opening months of the war, the Atlantic Ocean was a hunting ground. German pocket battleships, fast, heavily armed cruisers roamed the shipping lanes, wreaking havoc on Allied supply lines. The most famous of these was the Admiral Graf Spee. She was a fearsome vessel, faster than the battleships that could sink her, and more powerful than the cruisers that could catch her. For weeks in late 1939, she terrorized the South Atlantic, sinking merchant ship after merchant ship. The Royal Navy was desperate to stop her. 3 British cruisers, HMS Exeter, HMS Ajax, and HMS Achilles, finally cornered her off the coast of Uruguay on December 13, 1939. The Battle of the River Plate began. On paper, the Graf Spee should have won easily. Her 11-inch guns had a longer range and packed a much heavier punch than the 6-inch and 8-inch guns of the British ships. The British commander, Commodore Henry Harwood, knew he was outgunned. His only chance was to split his force and attack from multiple directions, forcing the Graf Spee to divide its fire. The battle was brutal. The Exeter was hit hard and forced to withdraw, heavily damaged. The Ajax and Achilles were also damaged, but they continued to harass the German ship. The Graf Spee, too, was not unscathed. She had been hit numerous times. While her armor had mostly held, her galley was destroyed, her fuel purification system was damaged, and she had suffered other critical system failures. Her captain, Hans Langsdorff, made a fateful decision. Instead of finishing off the battered British cruisers and escaping into the vast Atlantic, he sought refuge in the neutral port of Montevideo, Uruguay, to make repairs. This is where the physical battle ended, and the poker game began. Under international law, a warship of a belligerent nation could only stay in a neutral port for a limited time, 24 hours, extendable to 72 for repairs. Langsdorff needed more time. The British, now led by diplomacy and deception, needed to make sure he didn't get it. The bluff was orchestrated by the British naval attaché in Montevideo. The goal was to convince Langsdorff that a massive, unbeatable British fleet was gathering just outside the River Plate estuary waiting for him. In reality, the British had nothing. The nearest heavy units, the battlecruiser Renown and the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, were thousands of miles away and would not arrive for days. The only ships outside the harbor were the 2 damaged light cruisers that had just fought him, Ajax and Achilles, soon joined by another cruiser, the Cumberland. They were no match for a repaired Graf Spee. The British deception was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The British and French merchant ships were ordered to leave Montevideo harbor at timed intervals. According to maritime law, a warship could not leave a neutral port within 24 hours of a merchant ship from an enemy nation. This legally trapped the Graf Spee in the harbor, buying the British more time for their bluff to work. Meanwhile, British intelligence agents in Montevideo planted rumors. They talked loudly in bars and cafes about the arrival of the Renown and the Ark Royal. The local newspapers, fed stories by British diplomats, ran headlines proclaiming a huge British fleet was lying in wait. The British even used radio deception. The cruiser Cumberland, which had arrived to relieve the battered Exeter, conducted a series of radio communications with a non-existent capital ship, creating the illusion of a much larger force. The signals were designed to be intercepted by German intelligence. Captain Langsdorff was trapped. His intelligence sources, his visual observations of shipping movements, and the relentless stream of media reports all told him the same story. He was hopelessly cornered. He believed that to take a ship out to sea would be a suicide mission, a useless sacrifice of his crew. He radioed Berlin for instructions. The response gave him the choice to fight through, be interned in Uruguay, or scuttle the ship. Convinced he was facing overwhelming odds, Langsdorff chose the third option. On December 17, 1939, the Admiral Graf Spee steamed out of Montevideo harbor. The world watched, expecting a climactic naval battle. Instead, a few miles offshore, the crew was taken off by German merchant ships, and massive explosions ripped through the vessel. The pride of the German surface fleet settled in the shallow water, a burning wreck scuttled by its own crew. Langsdorff had been completely fooled by a bluff. He took his own life a few days later. The Battle of the River Plate wasn't won by guns alone, it was won by a lie. A book that delves deep into this is The Battle of the River Plate by Dudley Pope, which uses official records to piece together the sequence of events. The questions that remain are haunting. How much did Langsdorff's own state of mind, after a long and stressful cruise and a violent battle, contribute to his willingness to believe the bluff? Did the German intelligence network in South America fail him completely? Or were they simply outmaneuvered? And what if he had called the bluff? What if the Graf Spee had come out with guns blazing against the small damaged force that was actually there? Number 14. How could the enemy's spies become your greatest asset? Intelligence is the lifeblood of warfare. Knowing what the enemy is planning is half the battle. Both sides in World War II invested enormous resources in building spy networks. The German intelligence service, the Abwehr, dispatched dozens of agents to Britain. Their mission was to report on troop movements, industrial production, and public morale, and to identify targets for bombing raids. They were meant to be Germany's eyes and ears inside the enemy's homeland, but an incredible thing happened. Almost all of them were caught, and instead of being imprisoned or executed, many of them were turned. They were given a choice: face the consequences or start working for Britain. This was the birth of the double cross system, or the XX system, for the Roman numeral 20. The operation, masterminded by the MI5 Section B1A, led by the astute intelligence officer John Masterman, was one of the most audacious and successful counter-espionage campaigns in history. The concept was simple in theory, but fiendishly complex in practice. Once a German agent was captured, they were persuaded to become a double agent. They would then continue to send reports back to their German handlers, but the content of those reports would be carefully crafted by British intelligence. The information had to be a perfect mix of truth and fiction. Had to contain enough verifiable but harmless truth to maintain the agent's credibility. For instance, an agent might report on a real bombing raid, but get the details of the damage slightly wrong, or report it a few hours after it happened. This built trust. Then, at critical moments, this trusted channel could be used to feed the Abwehr a piece of devastatingly false information. One of the most famous of these double agents was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spanish citizen who hated the German regime. He initially approached the British to offer his services as a spy, but they turned him down. Undeterred, he got himself recruited by the Abwehr, created a whole fictional identity for himself, and moved to Lisbon. From there, he began sending reports to Germany about Britain, which he fabricated entirely from guidebooks, newspapers, and his own vivid imagination. His reports were so convincing that the Abwehr thought he was one of their best agents in Britain, even though he had never been there. Eventually, he made contact with the British again, and this time they realized his potential. They brought him to Britain and gave him the codename Garbo. With MI5's help, Garbo's fictional spy network grew to include 27 sub-agents, all of whom were completely imaginary. He sent hundreds of messages to his German handlers, a mix of chicken feed and poison. His greatest contribution would come in 1944, as part of the deception for the D-Day landings. The XX system allowed the British to do more than just neutralize the German spy network. It allowed them to actively control it. They knew what the German high command was being told, because they were the ones writing the script. They could gauge the effectiveness of their deception campaigns by monitoring the Abwehr's reactions and requests for more information. Ben McIntyre's book, Double Cross: The True Story of the D-Day Spies, provides a gripping account of these agents and their handlers. It was a stressful, high-wire act. One mistake, one piece of information that was too obviously false, could expose the entire system. The agents themselves lived in constant fear. They were traitors to their original masters, and their British handlers never fully trusted them. The system was so successful that by the end of the war, British intelligence was in control of every single German agent in Britain. The Abwehr believed they had a thriving network of spies. In reality, they had a puppet show, and MI5 was pulling the strings. It was a total, comprehensive penetration of the enemy's intelligence apparatus. This system formed the bedrock for many of the other great bluffs of the war, providing a direct, trusted channel into the minds of the German military planners. The unanswered questions are fascinating. How did MI5 manage the psychology of these double agents, men living a life of constant deception and fear? Were there any agents who managed to secretly remain loyal to Germany, playing a triple cross game that was never discovered? And what was the full extent of the bad information fed to the German command, and how many disastrous military decisions were based on the lies crafted in a small office in London? Number 13, could you destroy a city to protect a secret? This is perhaps the most controversial and chilling story of deception in the entire war, and it may not even be true. It revolves around the city of Coventry, England. On the night of November 14th, 1940, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, launched a massive bombing raid on the city. For 11 hours, hundreds of bombers dropped high explosives and incendiary bombs, creating a firestorm that gutted the historic city center and its medieval cathedral. The raid was devastating, killing hundreds of civilians and injuring thousands. It was a symbol of the war's brutality. The controversy lies in a persistent theory that Winston Churchill and British intelligence knew the raid was coming, knew Coventry was the target, and deliberately chose not to act in order to protect their most vital secret. That secret was Ultra, at a secret location called Bletchley Park. A team of brilliant minds, including the pioneering computer scientist Alan Turing, had achieved the seemingly impossible. They had broken the German Enigma code. The Enigma machine was a sophisticated cipher device used by the German military to encrypt its communications. The ability to read these messages gave the Allies an unprecedented window into the enemy's plans. It was the single greatest intelligence advantage of the war. But it was a fragile advantage. Like, if the German command ever suspected that Enigma had been compromised, they would change the system, and the window would slam shut. Therefore, protecting the secret of Ultra was paramount. Any action taken based on an Ultra decrypt had to be explainable by other means. For example, if Ultra revealed the location of a U-boat, the Royal Navy would have to send a reconnaissance plane to find it first before launching an attack. This was the plausible deniability that kept the secret safe. The theory, popularized by F.W. Winterbotham in his 1974 book The Ultra Secret, goes like this through Ultra intercepts. British intelligence knew several days in advance that a major raid, codenamed Moonlight Sonata, was planned. As the date approached, they decrypted enough of the signal to know that the target was one of 3 cities, including Coventry. The final piece of the puzzle, confirming Coventry as the specific target, allegedly arrived hours before the raid, giving Churchill a terrible choice. He could order a full-scale evacuation of the city and move in anti-aircraft guns, which would save lives but would also signal to the Germans that their codes were being read. Or he could do nothing, sacrifice the city, and protect the secret. According to the theory, he chose the latter. He played the long game, sacrificing hundreds of his own citizens to preserve the intelligence source that would ultimately help win the war. However, the majority of historians have since refuted this version of events. Meticulous research into the declassified records at the National Archives, detailed in books like Peter Calvacressi's Top Secret Ultra, paints a different picture. The intelligence from Ultra was far from clear. The British knew a raid was coming, but the code name for the target was not one they recognized. They correctly deduced it was likely in the Midlands, but they didn't have a specific city. Countermeasures were taken for a wide area, but a concentrated defense of Coventry was not possible without precise intelligence. The picture was fuzzy, a mosaic of probabilities, not the single, clear warning that Winterbotham's account suggests. By this historical consensus, the Coventry story is less a cold-blooded sacrifice and more a tragic example of the fog of war and the limitations of intelligence, even a source as miraculous as Ultra. But the story persists because it speaks to the brutal logic of total war. It forces us to confront the kind of impossible choices that leaders must make. Whether true or not, the Coventry bluff is a bluff on history itself. It represents the idea of a sacrifice so profound it had to be concealed, not just from the enemy, but from one's own people. It was a necessary deception to protect a greater truth. This leaves us with profound, unsettling questions. Even if the mainstream historical account is correct, what smaller, undocumented choices were made during the war based on this same terrible logic? Were other lives, perhaps a convoy or a small military unit, sacrificed to protect the ultra secret? And if a leader was faced with the exact same choice, today certain knowledge of an attack, and the need to protect a vital intelligence source, what would they do? Number 12. How did a fleet of battleships sail through the English Channel unseen? The English Channel is a bottleneck. It is one of the busiest and most heavily patrolled waterways in the world. During the war, it was a lethal gauntlet, bristling with British coastal artillery, minefields, torpedo boats, and constant air patrols. For a major enemy warship to even think of passing through it was considered suicidal. In February 1942, the German Navy did the unthinkable. In an operation codenamed Cerberus, two battleships, the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau, and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, along with a flotilla of destroyers and torpedo boats, sailed from their base in Brest, France, right through the Strait of Dover in broad daylight, and made it back to their home ports in Germany. It was an audacious feat of arms, but it was also a brilliant bluff. The German ships had been bottled up in the French port of Brest for months. They were a constant threat to Atlantic convoys, but they were also sitting ducks for raft bombing raids. The German leader wanted them brought home where they could be used to counter a potential Allied invasion of Norway. The German Naval Command concluded that the shortest route, right up the channel, was paradoxically the safest. The British would never expect it. They would be expecting a breakout into the Atlantic under the cover of darkness and bad weather. The entire German plan was based on surprise and overwhelming the British defenses with speed and concentrated force. The bluff was to make the British believe that such a move was too insane to be attempted. The execution was meticulously planned. The German fleet would sail under the strongest possible fighter escort the Luftwaffe could provide, an operation codenamed Donnerkeil Thunderbolt. They timed their departure to pass through the narrowest part of the channel, the Strait of Dover, during daylight to take full advantage of this air cover. They also mounted a massive electronic warfare campaign. German jamming stations along the French coast filled the British coastal radar frequencies with so much noise that the operators were effectively blinded. The British radar chain, a cornerstone of their defense, was rendered useless at the critical moment.
The Channel Dash, as the British called it, began on the night of February 11th, 1942. The fleet slipped out of Brest and sailed up the channel.
They achieved complete surprise. They were not spotted by British reconnaissance for hours. The first confirmed sighting came from a Spitfire pilot who could scarcely believe his eyes. The British response was frantic and piecemeal. Torpedo boats attacked but were driven off by the powerful screen of destroyers. Ancient swordfish torpedo bombers, slow-moving biplanes, made incredibly brave but suicidal attacks against the heavily armed fleet. 6 swordfish went in. None came back. Coastal artillery at Dover fired at extreme range but scored no hits. The RAF scrambled to attack, but they were met by the massive German fighter screen. The German fleet pressed on. Both Scharnhorst and Gneisenau struck mines, but both were able to continue under their own power. By the morning of February 13th, they had reached German waters. It was a stunning operational success for the Germans, but a huge embarrassment for the British. Like, the public was outraged. How could the enemy's main fleet sail through their backyard without being stopped? An official inquiry followed. The post-mortem, as documented in John Dean Potter's book, Fiasco: The Break Out of the German Battleships, revealed a string of failures, poor weather hampering reconnaissance, the effective German radar jamming, and a failure of imagination at the highest levels of the British command. They had simply not believed the Germans would dare to do it. The Germans had bluffed by doing the one thing their opponent thought impossible. However, in strategic terms, the Channel Dash was a victory for the British. The German battleships were now out of the Atlantic, where they could no longer threaten the vital convoy routes. They were bottled up in German ports, and their threat was contained. Churchill himself remarked that while the operation was a tactical German victory, it was a strategic defeat for them. They had traded a queen for a rook. They had won the hand, but it was a hand that weakened their overall position in the game. What unknowns still surround this event? How close did the piecemeal British attacks come to actually stopping one of the capital ships? What was the full extent of the German electronic warfare effort, and were there technologies used that remain classified? And what would have happened if the British had anticipated the move and prepared a proper trap with the full force of the home fleet? Or number 11, could an old destroyer and a few commandos take out a fortress? The port of St. Nazaire on the French Atlantic coast was a dagger pointed at the heart of Britain's Atlantic lifeline. It was the only German-controlled port on the Atlantic with a dry dock, big enough to service their largest battleships, like the fearsome Tirpitz. As long as that dry dock was operational, the Tirpitz could freely operate in the Atlantic, knowing it had a safe place to go for repairs. The British decided that the St. Nazaire dock had to be destroyed. But how? It was deep inside enemy territory, miles up the Loire estuary, and protected by some of the heaviest anti-aircraft and coastal defense guns in the world. A bombing raid was too inaccurate. A traditional naval assault was suicidal. They needed something different. They needed a bluff. The plan was codenamed Operation Chariot, and it was one of the most daring raids of the entire war. The idea was simple and borderline insane. They would pack an old, obsolete destroyer with tons of high explosives, disguise it as a German vessel, and ram it directly into the outer gate of the dry dock. Commandos hidden on the ship and in a flotilla of small motor launches would then swarm ashore, destroying other key port facilities like pumping stations and winch houses. The explosives in the destroyer were on a time delay fuse. The ship itself was the bomb. The raid was set for March 28, 1942. The vessel chosen for this suicide mission was HMS Campbelltown, an old American destroyer given to Britain as part of the Lend-Lease Agreement. She was modified to look like a German Mo-class torpedo boat. Her funnels were reshaped, her silhouette was altered, and she flew the German naval ensign. The Bluff was everything. The Campbelltown and its small escort of motor launches had to sail 60 miles up a heavily defended estuary. Their only hope was to fool the German gunners long enough to get close. As they approached the outer defenses of Saint Nazaire, they were challenged by shore stations. Using a captured German codebook, a specially trained British signalman on the bridge of the Campbelltown flashed back responses in German, claiming they were friendly vessels requesting permission to enter the port. For a few crucial minutes, the bluff held. The German gunners were confused. The ships looked German. Their signals were correct, but something felt wrong. Searchlights swept across the water, fixing on the strange convoy. Finally, a German officer realized the deception. The order was given to open fire. The night exploded. Every German gun in the harbor opened up on the small flotilla. The motor launches, made of wood and carrying extra fuel, were turned into floating infernos. The commandos aboard suffered terrible casualties, but the Campbelltown, under a storm of fire, did not deviate. With her engines at full speed, she smashed head-on into the massive steel gate of the dry dock, embedding herself deep within the structure. The commandos, who were still alive, scrambled ashore and began their demolition work, fighting desperate, heroic battles in the dockyards. The plan had worked, but at a terrible cost. Of the 611 men who took part in the raid, 169 were killed and over 200 were captured. Only a handful made it back to Britain. The Germans thought the raid was over. They had repulsed the attack and captured the survivors. They swarmed over the strange destroyer stuck in their dock gate, examining the damage. They didn't know about the 4 tons of explosives hidden in its bow, set on a timer. The next morning, as a group of senior German officers and technicians were inspecting the ship, it detonated. The explosion was immense. It completely destroyed the dry dock gate and killed hundreds of the German personnel on the scene. The Saint Nazaire dry dock, the only one on the Atlantic that could hold the Tirpitz, was out of action for the rest of the war. The Tirpitz never ventured into the Atlantic again. The greatest raid of all, as it became known, was a stunning success, born from a simple but incredibly brave bluff. The story is powerfully told in C. Lucas Phillips' book, The Greatest Raid of All. Some questions about the raid are still debated by military historians. How much did the Germans know beforehand? Were there intelligence leaks that made them suspicious, explaining their eventual quick reaction? What was the true number of German casualties in the final explosion, a figure that was never officially confirmed? And how was the morale and planning of the German Navy affected by such an audacious, almost unbelievable enemy attack on one of their most secure bases? Number 10. How did America bluff its way back into the war? In early 1942, America was reeling. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered the U.S. Pacific Fleet and the nation's morale. In the months that followed, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific, conquering the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. It seemed like an unstoppable tide. The American public needed a victory, a sign that the war was not lost. President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew this. He turned to his military chiefs with a simple but almost impossible demand: find a way to strike back at the Japanese mainland. He wanted to bomb Tokyo. The problem was distance. No American land-based bomber had the range to fly from a friendly base, bomb Japan, and return. The U.S. Navy's aircraft carriers couldn't get close enough to launch their short-range aircraft without being detected and destroyed by the Japanese fleet. The solution came from a Navy captain named Francis Lowe, and it was a plan that belonged more in a movie than a military briefing. The idea was to use long-range, land-based U.S. Army bombers, the B-25 Mitchell, and have them take off from an aircraft carrier. This had never been done before. A B-25 was far larger and heavier than any plane designed for carrier operations. No one knew if it could even get off the deck. The mission was entrusted to Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy Doolittle, a famous airman and aviation pioneer. He assembled a crew of volunteers for a secret, hazardous mission. They trained in short-field takeoffs, practicing over and over, pushing the B-25s to their limits. The plan was a one-way trip. After bombing their targets in Tokyo and other Japanese cities, they would not have enough fuel to return to the carrier. They were to continue flying west and try to land in friendly parts of China. It was a mission with a very high probability of failure. The raid itself was a massive strategic bluff. The physical damage it could inflict with just 16 bombers was negligible. Tokyo would not be destroyed. The real target was psychological. It was designed to sow doubt in the minds of the Japanese leadership and public, who had been told their homeland was invulnerable. And it was designed to give the American people a much-needed morale boost. On April 18, 1942, the plan was put into action. The aircraft carrier USS Hornet, carrying Doolittle's 16 B-25s on its deck, sailed deep into enemy waters, escorted by the carrier USS Enterprise. They were spotted by a Japanese patrol boat sooner than planned. The element of surprise was partially lost. Doolittle had to make a choice: abort the mission or launch early from much farther out at sea than planned. He chose to launch. One by one, the heavy bombers roared down the short flight deck of the Hornet and clawed their way into the air. It was a miracle of airmanship. They flew for hours at low level to avoid detection before reaching Japan. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. Air raid sirens blared across Tokyo as the American bombers appeared overhead, dropping their small loads of bombs on military and industrial targets. The physical damage was, as expected, light, but the psychological impact was immense. The Doolittle raid, as it became known, was a stunning propaganda victory for the United States. It proved that America was still in the fight and could reach out and touch the Japanese homeland. In Japan, the raid caused panic and embarrassment for the military leadership. It forced them to pull valuable fighter units back to Japan to defend the home islands, weakening their forces on other fronts. More importantly, it was a major factor in Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's decision to press for a decisive battle to destroy the American carriers once and for all. This desire to force a final confrontation would lead directly to the Battle of Midway 2 months later. The Doolittle raid was a bluff that paid off in ways its planners could never have imagined. It was a tiny military pinprick that triggered a massive strategic overreaction from the enemy. The story is captured in many books, including 30 Seconds Over Tokyo by Captain Ted W. Lawson, one of the pilots on the raid. What mysteries still linger? How much did the Japanese military know about the approaching task force from their picket boats before communications were lost? Were there alternative, even more daring, plans for the raid that were considered and rejected? And what was the full story of the airmen who crash-landed in China and Russia, a tale of survival and hardship that is often overshadowed by the raid itself? Number 9. Can you win a battle by convincing the enemy you're somewhere else? The Eastern Front was a theater of war on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Millions of men, tens of thousands of tanks and aircraft locked in a titanic struggle across a front that stretched for over 1,000 miles. In the summer of 1944, the Soviet Red Army was preparing to launch a massive offensive, Operation Bagration, designed to shatter the German Army Group Center in Belarusia. It would be one of the largest and most decisive operations of the war, but to succeed, the Soviets needed to achieve complete surprise. They needed to convince the German high command that the main summer offensive was coming somewhere else entirely. They needed to employ their own unique and highly developed doctrine of military deception, maskirovka. Maskirovka is a Russian term that means more than just camouflage. It is a broad concept that encompasses deception, concealment, and misdirection at every level, from a single soldier hiding in a foxhole to a massive strategic feint involving entire armies. For Operation Bagration, the Soviets planned and executed the largest Maskirovka campaign in military history. The goal was to fool the Germans into believing the main Soviet attack would come in the south, towards Romania, a sector where the Soviets had launched previous offensives. The German leadership, including their most respected commander on the front, Field Marshal Walter Model, was convinced the south was the danger zone. The Soviets did everything possible to reinforce this belief. The deception was multi-layered. The Soviets created a massive concentration of phantom forces in the south. They used dummy tanks, wooden artillery pieces, and fake aircraft to create the illusion of huge armies massing for an attack. Radio traffic was manipulated on a grand scale. They broadcast enormous volumes of fake radio messages, simulating the communications of several tank armies preparing for an offensive. At the same time, in the central sector where the real attack would take place, strict radio silence was enforced. Real troop movements were conducted only at night. Camouflage discipline was absolute. Entire armies with thousands of tanks, guns, and trucks were moved into their attack positions in secret, right under the noses of the Germans. Partisan groups operating behind German lines were tasked with diversionary attacks in the south to further distract and confuse the German command. The level of detail was astonishing. The German intelligence services completely fell for the bluff. Their aerial reconnaissance saw the buildup in the south. Their signals intelligence intercepted the massive increase in radio traffic. Their informers reported on the partisan activity. Everything pointed to a major attack in the south. Their army group center in the central part of the front was considered a quiet sector. The Germans even moved some of their best panzer divisions from the center to the south to meet the expected threat, fatally weakening the very area the Soviets were about to attack. On June 22, 1944, 3 years to the day after the German invasion of the Soviet Union began, Operation Bagration was launched. Nearly 2 million Soviet soldiers, supported by 6,000 tanks and 8,000 aircraft, smashed into the depleted and unsuspecting German Army Group Center. The German front collapsed. In just over a month of fighting, the Germans suffered catastrophic losses. An entire army group was effectively annihilated. It was a disaster on a scale that dwarfed Stalingrad. The Red Army advanced hundreds of miles, liberating all of Belarusia and pushing into Poland. The success of Operation Bagration was a direct result of the success of the Maskirovka. The Soviets had bluffed the German army into looking the wrong way while they delivered the knockout blow. David M. Glantz's seminal work, Soviet Military Deception in the Second World War, provides exhaustive detail on the planning and execution of this campaign. We are still left to wonder about some aspects of this massive deception. How much dissent was there within the German high command about, the location of the Soviet offensive? Were there any intelligence analysts who saw through the bluff but were ignored? What specific techniques of radio deception did the Soviets use that were so effective? And to what extent was the success of the Maskirovka due to Soviet skill versus a German high command that was increasingly prone to wishful thinking and self-deception? Number 8, how did a handful of rats hold a fortress against a legend? In the spring of 1941, the German Afrika Korps, under the command of the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, was sweeping across the deserts of North Africa. The British forces were in full retreat, but one small coastal town in Libya held out Tobruk. The defense of Tobruk became a legend. For 241 days, a garrison composed mostly of the tough, irreverent Australian 9th Division held the besieged port against relentless German and Italian attacks. They became known as the Rats of Tobruk, a nickname they adopted with pride. Their dogged defense was a story of pure grit, but it was also a story of clever deception. The defenders of Tobruk were outnumbered and outgunned. They were cut off, supplied only by sea at night by the Royal Navy in what was called the Spithead Run. They knew they couldn't match Rommel's forces in a straight fight, so they used the desert environment and their own ingenuity to create a series of bluffs to fool the attackers. They became masters of camouflage and misdirection. One of their most famous tricks was the dummy minefield. They had a limited supply of real anti-tank mines, which they laid in key defensive areas, but to make their defenses seem much more formidable, they created vast fake minefields. They would simply cordon off large areas of desert with wire and put up signs in German and Italian warning of mines. To sell the illusion, they would send out small patrols to lay the non-existent mines in full view of German reconnaissance positions. The German tank commanders, unwilling to risk their precious panzers, would treat these dummy fields with the same caution as real ones, channeling their attacks into predictable kill zones where the Australian anti-tank guns were waiting. They also used sonic deception. They would move their few precious artillery pieces around constantly, a technique known as roving guns. A single gun, firing from several different positions in quick succession, could give the impression of a much larger battery. They used captured German weapons to fire back at the enemy, adding to the confusion. Another clever bluff was the scrap iron trick. They would scatter pieces of scrap metal in front of their defensive positions. When German tanks advanced, the metal would make loud clanking noises as the tracks ran over it, often causing inexperienced crews to think they had hit a mine and halt their advance, making them easy targets. Perhaps their most elaborate deception was a fake supply dump. They knew Rommel's reconnaissance planes were constantly trying to identify their key logistical hubs to target for air raids. The Australians built a very obvious, poorly camouflaged dump in a prominent location. It was a collection of empty boxes, old fuel drums, and worthless junk. The German planes spotted it, identified it as a major supply depot, and wasted tons of bombs destroying it, while the real carefully hidden supply dumps remained safe. This was the work of what was known as the Tobruk Camouflage School, a group of soldiers who applied theatrical principles to warfare. The whole siege, as detailed in books like The Rats of Tobruk by Paul Hamm, was a masterclass in how a weaker force can use deception to level the playing field. The psychological aspect was just as important. The defenders of Tobruk cultivated an attitude of aggressive defiance. They conducted constant patrols into no man's land, harassing the besieging forces, taking prisoners, and creating the impression that they were much stronger and more numerous than they actually were. This constant pressure wore down the morale of the Axis troops. Rommel, one of the greatest commanders of the war, was held at bay for 8 months by a trapped garrison that refused to break, partly because that garrison bluffed him into thinking their defenses were stronger and their numbers greater than they really were. What do we still not know about the siege? What was the full extent of the intelligence the defenders were receiving from a force and other deception units outside the fortress? How many Axis attacks were blunted or completely deterred by dummy defenses that we have no record of? And how did the individual soldiers come up with these small-scale deceptions, the unrecorded acts of trickery that helped them survive day to day? Number 7. Could you hide the most important waterway in the world? We return to Jasper Maskelyne, the stage magician. While his role at El Alamein may have been exaggerated, his work with the camouflage experimental section in the Middle East did involve some incredible projects based on principles of illusion. One of the most critical assets in the entire theater was the Suez Canal. It was the artery through which troops and supplies flowed from across the British Empire to the front lines in North Africa. Its destruction would have been a strategic disaster of the first order. The canal was a prime target for nighttime bombing raids by the German and Italian air forces. The problem was, a long, straight body of water is almost impossible to hide, especially on a clear, moonlit night. Maskelyne and his magic gang were tasked with finding a solution. The account, again primarily from Maskelyne's own book, details a plan of breathtaking ambition. If they couldn't hide the canal, perhaps they could blind the pilots trying to bomb it. The idea they came up with was to use a series of powerful, swirling searchlights. These weren't intended to illuminate the bombers for the anti-aircraft guns. Instead, they were designed to create a dazzling, disorienting curtain of light. A chain of 24 searchlights was set up along a 9-mile stretch of the canal. Each light was fitted with a special spinning, mirrored cone that would throw a huge wheel of light, 5 miles wide and 5 miles high, into the sky. When enemy bombers approached, these lights would be switched on, creating a dizzying, strobing vortex of light that would completely ruin the pilot's night vision and make it impossible for them to pick out the thin ribbon of the canal below. The system was allegedly tested and proved incredibly effective. Pilots who flew through the dazzle light field reported feeling vertigo and being completely unable to see their instruments, let alone a target on the ground. According to Maskelyne, this system was deployed and successfully protected the canal from numerous air raids. This application of illusion, using light not for illumination but for confusion, was a direct transfer of a stage magic principle to the battlefield. Another one of Maskelyne's claimed projects was even more audacious, creating a phantom submarine fleet. In the harbor at Alexandria, he said his team built a number of dummy submarines using canvas and wood frames over old barges. The idea was to fool Axis aerial reconnaissance into believing the British Mediterranean fleet was much stronger than it actually was, potentially deterring an Italian naval attack. While, like his other stories, the scale of Maskelyne's involvement is disputed, the core ideas were part of the broader Allied deception effort in the region, masterminded by Dudley Clark. The Clark's force was constantly experimenting with new techniques. Official records confirm the widespread use of things like dummy vehicles, fake railway lines, and deceptive lighting schemes. For example, they developed techniques to make a stretch of desert look like a harbor full of ships at night, using carefully placed lights, and to make a real harbor look like empty desert. The work of a force, as documented in declassified files at the UK National Archives, shows a systematic and scientific approach to deception. Whether Maskelyne was the genius inventor or simply a skilled technician carrying out the plans of others, the principle remained the same trick: the enemy's perception. Make them see what you want them to see. The questions that remain are tantalizing. Was the dazzle light system as effective as Maskelyne claimed? And if so, why was it not used more widely in other theaters of the war? What other small-scale theatrical deceptions were used in the Mediterranean that were never officially recorded? And how much of Dudley Clark's Air Force archive is still classified, holding the secrets to even more bizarre and brilliant bluffs? Number 6. How do you set a trap when the enemy knows your every move? By mid-1942, the war in the Pacific was on a knife's edge. The Japanese High Command, stung by the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, decided it was time to eliminate the U.S. carrier fleet for good. Admiral Yamamoto devised a complex plan to lure the Americans into a trap. The target was the tiny atoll of Midway, a strategically important American outpost. The Japanese plan was to attack and invade Midway, knowing the U.S. Navy would have to respond. When the American carriers sailed to defend the island, Yamamoto's own powerful carrier fleet, waiting unseen, would fall upon them and destroy them. The Japanese possessed overwhelming naval superiority. It was a good plan, but it had one fatal flaw. The Americans were reading their mail. The U.S. Navy's code-breaking unit in Hawaii, Station Hypo, led by the eccentric genius Commander Joseph Rochefort, had partially broken the main Japanese naval code JN-25. They were picking up fragments of the Japanese plan, but there were gaps. They knew a major operation was coming, and they knew the target was codenamed AF. But they didn't know what AF was. The intelligence staff in Washington believed it was in the South Pacific, or possibly even the U.S. West Coast. Rochefort and his team were convinced it was Midway. They needed to prove it. This is where one of the war's simplest and most elegant bluffs came into play. Rochefort devised a test. He asked the naval base at Midway to send a message in the clear using an unencrypted channel, reporting that their water purification system had broken down and they were short on fresh water. The message was sent via a secure underwater cable to Midway and then broadcast as if it were a genuine local emergency. The trap was set. A few days later, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese intelligence report coded in JN-25. The report stated that AF was short on fresh water. That was it. The bluff had worked. The Americans now knew for certain that the massive Japanese offensive was aimed at Midway. This single piece of intelligence, gained through a simple, clever trick, changed everything. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, now held the cards. He knew where and when the Japanese would strike. He knew their order of battle. The Japanese, on the other hand, were sailing into a battle believing they had complete surprise. Nimitz had only 3 aircraft carriers, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, against the 4 heavy carriers of the main Japanese strike force. He was outnumbered, but he had the ultimate advantage: knowledge. He positioned his carriers to ambush the Japanese fleet. The Battle of Midway, fought between June 4th and 7, 1942, was the result. American dive bombers catching the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment while their planes were rearming and refueling on deck sank all 4 of them in a matter of hours. In exchange, the U.S. lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown. It was one of the most decisive naval victories in history. In a single day, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted permanently. The victory was made possible by the courage of the American pilots, but the foundation of that victory was laid in a basement office in Hawaii by a team of codebreakers and their simple, brilliant bluff. The story is a testament to the power of intelligence. The book And I Was There, Pearl Harbor and Midway Breaking the Secrets by Rear Admiral Edwin T. Layton, Nimitz's chief intelligence officer, gives a first-hand account of the tension and triumph of this intelligence coup. The Japanese had the better hand, but Nimitz knew what they were holding. In poker, that's an unbeatable advantage. The lingering questions are profound. How close did Station Hypo come to not breaking the code in time? Was there any suspicion on the Japanese side that their codes were compromised before Midway? And what if the water shortage bluff had failed? How would the battle and the war in the Pacific have unfolded differently if the U.S. Navy had been sailing blind? Number 5, could you create a whole army out of rubber and sound? As the spring of 1944 approached, the Allies were preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history, the invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord. The success of the D-Day landings depended on surprise. Not surprised that an invasion was coming, the Germans knew it was, but surprised about where it would land. The Allies needed to convince the German High Command that the main attack would come at the Pas de Calais, the closest point between England and France. Normandy was to be seen as a diversion. This grand deception was called Operation Fortitude, and to sell the lie, the Allies created an army that didn't exist. This phantom army was the first U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. It was headquartered in Dover, directly across the channel from Calais. It had a famous, aggressive commander whom the Germans both feared and respected, General George S. Patton. The Germans considered Patton the Allies' best general, and they couldn't imagine a major invasion happening without him in charge. So the Allies gave him command of their ghost army. FUSAG had divisions, corps, and a whole order of battle, all of it on paper. But to make it real, they needed a physical presence. This is where the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a top-secret unit known as the Ghost Army, came in. The Ghost Army was a unique unit of about 1,100 men, many of them recruited from art schools, advertising agencies, and sound engineering studios. Their job was to impersonate other, much larger U.S. Army units. They were masters of illusion. They had a collection of inflatable rubber tanks, artillery pieces, and trucks. From the air, or from a distance, these dummies were indistinguishable from the real thing. A handful of men could inflate an entire armored division in a few hours. They would arrange the dummy vehicles in convincing convoys and encampments to be spotted by German reconnaissance planes. Their deception went beyond the visual. The Ghost Army had a sonic warfare component. They had powerful speakers mounted on trucks from which they would play meticulously crafted sound recordings. They could simulate the sound of a tank division on the move, the noise of an engineering battalion building a bridge, or the chatter of soldiers in a camp. They would play these sounds at night, near the coast of Dover, creating the auditory illusion of a massive army preparing to embark. This was all part of the radio deception plan, Operation Quicksilver. A huge volume of fake radio traffic was generated for FUSAG, simulating the day-to-day communications of a real army group. Double agents like Garbo were feeding reports to their German handlers, confirming the existence and strength of Patton's army group in the southeast of England. The bluff was overwhelmingly successful. The German High Command, including the German leader himself, swallowed it whole. They became convinced that FUSAG was the main Allied invasion force, and that the primary target was the Pas de Calais. Even after the D-Day landings began in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Germans held their most powerful units, the 15th Army in the Calais region, in reserve. They believed Normandy was a feint, a diversionary attack designed to draw the reserves away before the real invasion by Patton's FUSAG at Calais. They kept the 15th Army waiting for an invasion that would never come for several crucial weeks. This delay was decisive. It gave the Allies the time they needed to establish and consolidate their beachhead in Normandy, to pour in men and material, and to ensure the invasion would not fail. The story of this unit was kept secret for decades and is brilliantly told in the book and documentary, The Ghost Army by Rick Beyer and Elizabeth Sales. The questions that remain are fascinating. How did the men of the Ghost Army handle the psychological stress of being a top-secret unit whose successes could never be acknowledged? Were there any close calls where their deception was almost discovered by German agents or reconnaissance? And what other smaller-scale deceptions did the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops conduct in the European theater that are still not widely known? Number 4. Who was the man who never was? In the spring of 1943, the Allies were preparing to invade southern Europe. The logical next step after their victory in North Africa was to invade the island of Sicily. It was a stepping stone to Italy, and the soft underbelly of Axis controlled Europe. The problem was the target was obvious. The German and Italian high commands knew Sicily was the most likely target and were heavily reinforcing it. The Allies needed to convince them that the real targets were elsewhere, Sardinia and Greece. To do this, a small team of British intelligence officers led by Ewan Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley hatched one of the most bizarre, macabre, and brilliant deception plans of the war. It was called Operation Mincemeat. The plan was to get a set of fake top-secret documents into the hands of the German High Command. But they couldn't just allow them to be captured in a way that looked suspicious. The discovery had to seem like a complete accident. Their solution was to use a dead body. They would dress a corpse in the uniform of a Royal Marines officer, plant the fake documents on him, and have him wash ashore on the coast of Spain, a country that was officially neutral but crawling with German intelligence agents. They hoped the Spanish authorities would find the body and, as was standard practice, allow the German agents to see the documents before returning them to the British. The first challenge was finding a suitable body. They obtained the corpse of a man who had recently died of pneumonia, a cause of death that was consistent with drowning. They then began to build a completely fictional identity for their man, Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. They gave him a backstory, a personality, a life. He was given an ID card, letters from his fiancée Pam, a letter from his father, ticket stubs from a London theater, and even an angry letter from his bank manager. These pocket litter items were designed to make Major Martin a real, believable person, to sell the authenticity of the whole package. The most important item was a briefcase chained to the body's wrist. Inside was a personal letter from one high-ranking British general to another, which casually but clearly laid out the Allied invasion plans. The letter stated that while there would be a diversionary attack on Sicily, the real invasions would be directed at Sardinia and Greece. The body of Major Martin was packed in dry ice and transported by submarine HMS Seraph to the coast of Huelva in southern Spain. On April 30th, 1943, the submarine surfaced, and the body was gently pushed into the sea to be carried ashore by the tide. The British intelligence team in London waited anxiously. Everything depended on the Spanish and the Germans taking the bait. The body was found by a Spanish fisherman. The local authorities, as predicted, informed the local German Abwehr agent. The agent, with the help of sympathetic Spanish officials, managed to borrow the documents, carefully open the envelopes, photograph the contents, and then return them. The Spanish then officially handed the body and the briefcase over to the British vice consul. The documents were returned to London, where forensic specialists confirmed they had been opened. The bluff had worked, the bait had been taken, the false intelligence made its way up the chain of command all the way to the German leader. He was completely convinced. He overruled his own generals who still believed Sicily was the target. He ordered major reinforcements to be moved from Sicily to Sardinia and Greece. Panzer divisions were redeployed. Torpedo boats were sent. Minefields were laid. When the Allies launched the real invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, on July 10th, 1943, they met far less resistance than they had anticipated. The island was conquered more quickly and with fewer casualties than projected. Operation Mincemeat had saved thousands of Allied lives. The story is told by the mastermind himself in Ewan Montagu's book, The Man Who Never Was, and more recently with newly declassified information in Ben McIntyre's Operation Mincemeat. The identity of the man who played Major Martin was a secret for decades, but he was eventually identified as Glyndwr Michael, a homeless man from Wales. Yet questions remain. Did any of the German intelligence officers ever suspect the documents were a plant? How much debate was there within the German high command about the authenticity of the intelligence? And was there a plan B if Operation Mincemeat had failed? Number 3, how do you invent a spy master to fool the world? Long before the grand deceptions of D-Day or the intricate plots in the Mediterranean, the foundations of the Allied deception strategy were being laid in the dust and heat of Cairo. The man responsible was a British officer named Dudley Clarke. He is widely considered to be the father of British strategic deception in World War II. He was an unconventional thinker, a master of lateral thought, and he understood that war was not just about fighting, but about making the enemy think you were going to fight somewhere else. In 1940, with British forces in North Africa vastly outnumbered by the Italians, General Archibald Wavell needed an edge. He turned to Clarke. Clarke's idea was to create a completely fictional military formation. It started as a small bluff, but it would grow into a sprawling imaginary order of battle that would confuse and mislead Axis intelligence for the rest of the war. Clarke created a file for a fictional unit, the 1st Special Air Service Brigade. He then started to generate paperwork for it, supply requests, movement orders, personnel appointments. He leaked information about this elite paratrooper unit to Italian spies in Cairo. The Italians took the bait. Soon, Italian intelligence was reporting on the existence of a British parachute brigade in Egypt, a unit that simply did not exist. This small success gave Clarke the green light for a much bigger idea. He established a formal deception planning department, which he cryptically named A-Force. The name itself was a bluff, designed to sound mundane and bureaucratic. Its real work was anything but. A-Force, under Clarke's brilliant and eccentric leadership, became a factory of lies. They pioneered many of the techniques that would later be used on a massive scale in Europe. They used the double-cross system, turning captured agents to feed false information. They used physical deception, building dummy tanks and creating fake supply dumps. They used sonic deception, but their greatest creation was the Phantom Army. A force created an entire, detailed, and utterly fictional order of battle for the British forces in the Middle East. They invented divisions, brigades, and whole army corps. They gave them names, histories, and commanders. They would then use their controlled spy network and other channels to leak information about these units to the Germans and Italians. For example, before the Battle of El Alamein, a force convinced German intelligence that the British had double the number of armored divisions than they actually possessed. This constant exaggeration of their strength made the German commanders more cautious and less willing to take risks. Dudley Clark was a theatrical character perfectly suited to his job. As recounted in the book, The Deceiver's Allied Military Deception in the Second World War by Thaddeus Holt, Clark was known for his odd habits and his almost obsessive attention to the details of his deceptions. He understood that a good lie needed to be supported by a mountain of small, verifiable truths. His work was so successful and so fundamental that he was later brought back to London to help plan Operation Fortitude. The Phantom Fusag army that fooled the Germans about D-Day was built on the principles and techniques that Clark had developed in the desert 2 years earlier. He was a spy master who invented other spy masters, the general of an army that existed only on paper and in the minds of the enemy. But how much of Clark's work remains unknown. His methods were so secretive that he often operated outside the normal channels of military command. What were his biggest failures, the bluffs that didn't work, and what did he learn from them? And how did one man's imagination and unconventional thinking so profoundly shape the intelligence landscape of the entire war? Number 2. How did a lie about where to land change? Everything. This was the big one. The culmination of every deception technique the Allies had learned throughout the war. Operation Fortitude was the bluff that made D-Day possible. The stakes could not have been higher. If the Germans correctly guessed the location of the invasion of France, they could concentrate their powerful panzer divisions and potentially drive the Allied forces back into the sea. The entire liberation of Western Europe hinged on making the German high command believe a lie. As we've seen, the lie was that the main invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, and Normandy was just a feint. Fortitude was the plan to sell that lie. It was divided into 2 parts, Fortitude North and Fortitude South. Fortitude North was designed to convince the Germans that the Allies were planning to invade Norway. The Allies created another Phantom Army, the British Fourth Army, based in Scotland. They used fake radio traffic, and double agents fed information about this fictitious force. The goal was to tie down the dozens of German divisions stationed in Norway, preventing them from being moved to France to reinforce the defenses there. This part of the plan was highly successful. The German divisions in Norway remained there, waiting for an invasion, long after the Normandy landings had taken place. But the main event was Fortitude South, the deception focused on the Pas de Calais. This was the home of Patton's fictional 1st U.S. Army Group Fusag. The physical deception of the Ghost Army, with its inflatable tanks and dummy landing craft concentrated in southeast England, was a key part. So was the radio deception, which created the electronic signature of a massive army preparing to cross the narrowest part of the channel. And the double agents of the XX system played their most important role. The agent Garbo in particular sent a stream of detailed reports to his German handlers about the strength and location of Fusag. On June 5th, the night before the D-Day landings, he sent a message warning that the invasion was imminent. When the landings happened at Normandy the next morning, Garbo's credibility with the Germans went through the roof. This set up the second and most critical phase of the bluff. After the Normandy landings began, Garbo and the other double agents sent messages to the Germans explaining that Normandy was exactly what they had predicted, a diversion. They insisted that the main attack by Patton's much larger army group was still to come at the Pas de Calais. The German high command, their belief in Fusag now reinforced by their trusted agents, bought it completely. The powerful 15th Army, with its panzer divisions, was held at Calais waiting. The German leader himself was convinced this was the case, and refused to release the reserves to attack the Normandy beachhead in its most vulnerable early hours. The Book of Bodyguard of Lies by Anthony Cave Brown is a comprehensive, if sometimes sprawling, account of the epic scale of the deceptions surrounding D-Day. For weeks, the Germans waited for the real invasion. Every day that the 15th Army sat idle was another day the Allies had to pour more men, more tanks, and more supplies into Normandy. By the time the German command finally realized they had been duped and that there was no Fusag, it was too late. The Allied beachhead was secure and too strong to be dislodged. The bluff had not just helped the landing succeed, it had guaranteed their success. It was arguably the single most important and impactful military deception in history. The lingering questions are immense. How close did the Germans come to seeing through the deception? There were some German intelligence officers who argued Normandy was the main attack, but they were overruled. Why? Was the German command structure so rigid and so dominated by one man's intuition that it was uniquely vulnerable to this kind of bluff? And what would have happened if Operation Fortitude had failed? Number one, what was the ultimate bluff of the entire war? The greatest bluff of the war wasn't a single operation. It wasn't a ghost army or a man who never was. It was a bluff of knowledge itself. It was the absolute, total, and unwavering protection of the fact that the Allies were reading the enemy's most secret messages. It was the secret of Ultra. Everything else, the double-cross system, Operation Mincemeat, the victory at Midway, the success of the Atlantic convoys was built upon, or enhanced by, the intelligence that flowed from Bletchley Park. Keeping the secret of Ultra was the strategic imperative that overshadowed all others, and keeping it secret required a constant, nerve-wracking bluff. Every piece of information gained from an Enigma decrypt had to be laundered. It had to be made to look as if it came from another source. If Ultra revealed the location of a German U-boat wolf pack gathering to attack a convoy, the Allies couldn't simply reroute the convoy. That would be too obvious. Instead, they would arrange for a long-range reconnaissance aircraft to happen to spot the U-boats. The rerouting would then be attributed to the aircraft sighting. This happened time and time again. Ships and lives were sometimes put at risk, and small sacrifices were made to protect the larger secret. The entire Allied command structure was engaged in a massive, ongoing deception designed to convince the Germans that their communications were secure. This bluff required incredible discipline. Only a very small number of people were cleared to see raw Ultra intelligence under the classification Top Secret Ultra. Commanders in the field would receive intelligence derived from Ultra, but it would be disguised as information from a highly reliable source, often implying it came from a human spy network. This protected the secret even within the Allied ranks. The Germans, for their part, were so convinced of the Enigma machine's invulnerability that they could not bring themselves to believe it had been broken. When they suffered unexplained setbacks, they blamed spies, traitors, or bad luck to be exactly anything but a compromise of their cipher system. Their own self-confidence was their greatest vulnerability the Allies exploited by, carefully maintaining the bluff. The impact of Ultra is almost impossible to overstate. It shortened the war. Some historians, like Sir Harry Hinsley, an official historian and Bletchley Park veteran, have estimated that Ultra shortened the war by at least 2 years, saving millions of lives. It gave Allied commanders an insight into the enemy's mind that was unprecedented in the history of warfare. You know, they knew where the enemy would be, what their strength was, and what their intentions were. It was like playing poker but being able to see your opponent's cards. The only trick was to not let your opponent know you could see them. That was the bluff. A bluff played every single day, on every front, for years. The success of this grand deception was the bedrock upon which so much of the Allied victory was built. The deepest questions are still debated. How much did the Germans really suspect? Were there elements within the German military's signals, intelligence who had serious concerns but were silenced by their superiors? To what extent did the need to protect Ultra force Allied commanders to make tactical decisions that cost lives in the short term? And what is the full human story of the thousands of men and women at Bletchley Park who held the fate of the world in their hands, but whose work and the incredible bluff they maintained remained a total secret for more than 30 years after the war ended?